Hi everybody, welcome back to Extra Credit, and this is our 19th episode on ancient Rome. So last time we saw how in the days of the Emperor Constantine, the Christian church started down the path that would eventually lead it to not only outlast but even replace the Roman Empire as the great uniting power of Europe for the next 1,000 years and more. But as you can imagine, not everybody was entirely thrilled with this trend, particularly an emperor named Julian. Julian was actually from Constantine's own family, but instead of following in the family footsteps, Julian rejected Christianity and did his best to sweep it back under the historical rug. For this reason, most of the history books give Julian the nickname Julian the Apostate, which means something like Julian the Sinner. Which means if we're going with the whole it's the winners who write the history books thing, yeah, Julian didn't win. So despite the fact that the church was on the rise, the 300s AD were really the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire itself, which after standing for 1,000 years was finally starting to crumble. Despite some occasional bright spots along the way, things would continue to unravel until the fateful year of 476 AD, when the last Western emperor was finally kicked out and the Western Empire came to an end once and for all. Which leads us to the great question of why. Why does an empire that lasts for almost 1,000 years and covers much of the known world for centuries suddenly stop existing? And no, it's not because the Ring and/or Death Star was destroyed, but good guess. Now, there have been literally hundreds of books written on this subject by dozens of historians, with explanations ranging anywhere from climate change to bad leadership to overconsumption of cheese curds. Okay, just kidding on the cheese curds one, but seriously, the fact that I just said that means that some historian somewhere right now is like, hey, that's a great thesis for my new book. But as one of my personal favorite historians, Adrian Goldsworthy, points out, the fall of Rome can be blamed on two important factors that were both interrelated: weakness on the inside and pressure from the outside. Starting with weakness on the inside, there were lots of factors at work here, but one of the most significant related to government, specifically the fact that emperors constantly kept on getting themselves assassinated. As we saw back in episode 16, this trend kicked off in the 200s, and despite some occasional periods of stability with guys like Diocletian or Constantine lasting for a pretty long time, this assassination problem never really went away. The simple truth is that in the final century or so of Rome's existence, being emperor was pretty much the most dangerous job on the planet. Like almost as bad as being on gatekeeper duty when the Black Riders show up. The fact was that emperors lived in an almost constant state of nervousness or outright paranoia, wondering who might be lying in wait plotting to kill them off. Which meant that rather spending their time thinking about things like, what can I do to strengthen and maintain Rome's glorious empire, they were instead thinking about things like, how can I make sure I'm still breathing in 5 more minutes? Oh shoot, look out, that guy's got a knife! Oh, don't worry, it's just the cook, no problem. Yeah, you can see why this didn't make for the most productive work environment. To make matters worse, it was often Rome's successful military commanders who posed the greatest threat to the emperor, which meant the emperors became more and more reluctant to trust their own generals, and therefore didn't use them very efficiently or effectively. After all, if you give your best commander 20,000 guys to go and kill some barbarians across the Rhine in Germany, who's to say he's not going to take those 20,000 guys and turn around and kill you instead? Now, on its own, this kind of internal weakness was bad enough, but it probably wouldn't have killed the empire all by itself. After all, for the sake of comparison, the Egyptian Empire lasted for about 2,000 years, and it went through plenty of periods of internal weakness, but the difference was that Egypt was totally isolated from its surrounding neighbors by the vast deserts on either side of it. The problem with Rome, on the other hand, is that it was not isolated. In fact, it was as far from isolated as humanly possible, being completely surrounded by the barbarian tribes of Europe. Which brings us to our second factor: pressure from outside. Now, before we get into the details of that pressure, let's take a moment to unpack the word barbarian itself, because it does need some explanation. Like so many other things in Western history, the word barbarian itself was actually invented by the ancient Greeks, who simply used it to refer to anybody who was not a Greek. You see, the Greeks had this idea that all other languages besides their own just sounded like somebody saying bar, 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 or in English terms, blah, 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 which means that we should probably call them blah, blah-ians, which sounds incredibly stupid. Anyhow, the Romans took this term barbarian, and they used it to refer to anybody who lived outside the Roman Empire and therefore engaged in barbaric and uncivilized practices such as eating raw meat, performing human sacrifice, and wearing pants. Remember, for the Romans it was toga or nothing. Now, these pants-wearing barbarians had lived alongside the empire for centuries, and their relationship with Rome had always been somewhat complicated. There were definitely times of conflict in which both Romans and/or barbarians were responsible for raiding or outright invasion of each other's territories, but there were also periods of peace and stability in which both sides traded with each other. As time went by, many barbarians even started serving in Rome's military, with one of Rome's greatest generals from the late Empire, a man named Stilicho, even being a barbarian himself. But after centuries of balance, the dominoes finally started to fall in about the year 370 AD, and the first push was provided by the most fearsome and terrifying barbarians of all, the Huns. Now, I know you already know all about the Huns from their totally accurate representation in Mulan, but for those of you who missed it, the Huns were basically a group of horseback-mounted archers from the plains of Central Asia who were the Balrog of barbarians. And yes, that reference will make more sense to those of you who remember this part from Lord of the Rings. Basically, as the Huns began to migrate westward, they were so terrifying that all the other barbarian groups tried to get out of their way and did everything they could to do this, excluding crawling straight up the smooth sides of stone pillars at a 90-degree angle, which I'm pretty sure only certain breeds of orcs can do. But seriously, the movement of the Huns to the west kicked off a whole series of barbarian migrations, which you can see pictured here on this incredibly simple and entirely uncomplicated map. But just for the sake of greater simplicity, we'll track the impact that the Huns had on one particular barbarian group, the Goths. No, not those kind of Goths. Yeah, those ones. The Goths were divided up into two general groups, the Eastern Goths, known as Ostrogoths, and the Western Goths, known as Visigoths, although it's important to note that these labels don't actually get used until much later on in history, and right now we probably shouldn't be too technical about naming them. But the simplest way to tell the story is that when the Huns decided to migrate, it was the Ostrogoths who first felt their wrath and were quickly conquered by the new menacing invaders. This understandably spooked their western neighbors, the Visigoths, who immediately packed up camp and hightailed it even further west, where in the fateful year of 376 AD, they ran smack into a massive river called the Danube, which just happened to form the border of, you guessed it, the Roman Empire. And this is where things began to get a little bit hairy. The terrified Visigoths begged the Romans to let them into the empire so they could be safe from the ferocious Huns. The Romans, as you can imagine, were somewhat less than thrilled to have thousands of desperate, shaggy-haired, pants-wearing barbarians show up on their doorstep, but they also saw in this a certain opportunity. You see, the Visigoths were actually less barbaric than other barbarian tribes, due to the fact that they had long lived in close proximity to Rome and had therefore already picked up certain Roman customs and habits. So after some consideration, the Romans decided to let the Visigoths in on the condition that the Visigoths serve in the Roman military in return for the Romans providing the Visigoths with land and food. It was the perfect arrangement. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, pretty much everything. You see, the Goths had barely crossed the river and were unpacking their bags when they started to complain that the Romans weren't actually meeting their end of the bargain by providing the Goths with food and land. This led to some pretty major bad blood between the two groups, which soon turned into real blood as the Goths launched a full-scale rebellion, moving through the Roman countryside, stealing whatever food they could find, and throwing in some burning and pillaging just to keep up the whole barbarian image. This culminated in 378 AD at the famous Battle of Adrianople, where an army of Goths crushed the Romans and even killed the Emperor Valens himself. But as horrifying as this defeat was for the Romans, things were about to get even worse. A new Gothic leader named Alaric arose and began to lead his people in search of the food and land that they had been promised. But this time, rather than roaming around out east, Alaric led his men straight to the heart of the empire in Italy itself and knocked on the door of the emperor, who was not actually at Rome. You see, by 402 AD, things had gotten so bad that the Western Emperor Honorius actually decided to ditch the city of Rome and make his own new personal capital at a place called Ravenna. Ravenna was in northern Italy, and it really had nothing to recommend it at all, other than the fact that it was totally isolated and therefore extremely hard to attack, which made it the perfect vacation destination for a nervous emperor. So rather than waste too much time at Ravenna, Alaric turned around and went straight for the jackpot: Rome itself. And on one of the darkest days in Roman history, August 24th, 410 AD, Alaric led his Gothic army into the city of Rome itself to loot, steal, and pillage everything in sight. So basically a barbarian shopping spree. This ransack, or simply sack of Rome, lasted for 3 harrowing days, and even though Alaric and his men respected Rome enough not to completely destroy it, it was still a terrifying and traumatizing ordeal for the citizens who lived through it. The Gothic sack of Rome in 410 AD sent shockwaves through the empire, being the first time in 800 years that Rome itself had been taken by enemies. And what gives this episode an even more tragic irony is the fact that the Goths never actually wanted to harm Rome at all. Instead, it was the poor decision-making of weak, short-sighted emperors that caused events to spiral out of control and led the Goths to feel that this was their only choice. With all this being said, the Roman Empire wasn't finished quite yet. There was still an emperor living at Ravenna after all, and the city of Rome itself was technically still standing. But even so, the world that dawned on the day after the Goths were finished having their way with Rome was in many ways a very different world indeed. Word of the disaster spread around the empire like wildfire, eventually reaching the ears of a Christian priest named Jerome, who lived in the city of Bethlehem. Upon hearing the devastating news of Rome's sack, Jerome apparently put down the Bible study he was working on and sat in complete silence for 3 entire days. And when he finally took up his quill to write again, it was to pen these words: "Who would believe that Rome, built up by the conquest of the whole world, had collapsed, that the mother of all nations became their tomb? If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" And that's the question we'll consider next time in our final episode. See you then. Hey everyone, thanks again for watching Extra Credit. It's always a blast to be with you guys and to have been making this series so far. Your challenge for this week is to look up some of the other reasons as to why Rome fell, because there are so many and there's no way I can possibly do them justice in this kind of series. As usual, stay safe, have fun, read a book, play outside, and we'll see you next time.